Hello to everyone. And I just don't know what to think after that opening. I do like to say hi to all of those that are online with us electronically, because this past Sabbath and then a couple days during the feast, we utilized that camera and that audio feed, and thanks to those that manage it, whether it be here locally or whether it be at a feast site, and also thank all of you for your prayers. Joy fell under the auspice of COVID, that dreaded word, but she's tested and she's clear, but she had a rough couple weeks. Me, I just stayed away from her. But anyway, so I'd really like to thank everybody once again for their prayers. It's amazing what God can do for us with a group like this praying for us. Speaking of the feast, very great time in Ireland. But I noticed some things that as we saw our credit card statements that we used, it was all good. It was all good, trust me. We had set across second tithe, but you know, the statements, they have all of these rules and regulations. And you know, there's foreign transaction fees if you're not careful, and there's all kinds of, contracts are just complex. The law that man has established in the United States or internationally is just ridiculous. As we look around us, we can see that in this world, there's a lot of deceitful promises. Legal contracts are overspoken in doublespeak with litigious technology. It's just mind-boggling sometimes. Have you ever read any of the contracts that you've signed? Have you read them through all the way? Did you understand them after you read them? They go back and forth, and it's like, no. The news that we see and hear are partial truths. We know that. With the election just passing, one says one thing and the other person denies it, and then they say the opposite about the other person and they deny it, and it's just ridiculous. It leaves us with a distorted sense of reality. If that would be all that we had to weigh the news, the information that we see, but no, God has opened our eyes, God has opened our minds to His truth, and it allows us to see past some of the world lies and deceptions. Given the wisdom and understanding from above, we now have the key to understanding of the promises of God. There's not a lot of promises that mankind understands out of this Bible, even though it's in black, white, and red. But yet, we do. Why? Because of God's inspiration, God's Spirit. If you request information electronically on your devices, whether it be a phone, laptop, computer, or if you're in college, one of those big mainframes, I don't know. But you see that this information that you request, ask it one time, how many promises of God are in the Bible? And because in doing this study, I was looking up and seeing various things, and one of them said there was 7,000 promises in the Bible of God. Now, I'm not here to dispute that, one way or the other. As a matter of fact, it's really irrelevant to me. I just know there's a lot of promises in our Bible that God has set aside for us, and He's also provided us with covenants. So, in addition to the promises, we find covenants that are detailed in our Bibles. Today, we can review a few of these covenants and discuss the promises that God has provided to us. Just coming back from the feast in Ireland, we had a very filling feast of sermons, fellowship, and just enjoying Ireland in totality. I mean, it was a real great feast. God chose to put His name there, and I can see why. It's just beautiful. The surroundings are beautiful, the rolling hills, the pastures full of sheep or cows and goats, and it was just beautiful for the eye to see. We saw castles of all various stages, some that are beautiful and modern and lived in, and others that are very disheveled and crumbling, but yet they're still awe-inspiring. The other thing that we saw was the closing of the hurricane here while we were over in Ireland, and we are happy to get away from it. As I know that some individuals like Mr. Peterson, he really had some devastating effects from the hurricane with flooding, etc. But we are pleased to get away from it. I'm sorry for those of you that had to suffer through it. But it was so beautiful over in Ireland. One of the most beautiful things that we saw was what God has shown us, and that's a rainbow. There was a beautiful rainbows from one end to the other, these big arcs, and just with glorious color and just amazing. You know, they have the perfect weather, I think, for rainbows. They have a lot of mist and a lot of occasional light rain there, and with the sun peering through, it just creates these beautiful rainbows. And I wondered, I talked to Mr. McTiernan since he was over there, you know, having that Irish background of his, I would think that he'd be in clue to look for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But he assured me, he and his wife and Reese, they didn't find any, and they didn't actually go looking for it because he knows better. Let's look. In addition to the Irish myth that we just talked about, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, it's also been counterfeited by the gay lesbian society. They use that rainbow as their motto, as their insignia and stuff. And is that what God intended? Is that what God set up with that rainbow? Let's look at the origins of the rainbow and the covenant of God without the cloak of the worldly deception hanging over it. Let's begin by looking in Genesis 6, where we can read the words of God about the creation and the reason for the rainbow. Genesis 6, and we'll begin in verse 17. And everybody here is familiar with that. I don't know if Jacob is yet. I don't know if we've got to the rainbow subject yet, but pretty soon we will. And behold, in verse 17 of Genesis 6, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under the heaven all flesh which is in the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Dropping down to verse 22, thus Noah did, according to all that God commanded him. So he did. Now, God was establishing a covenant not only with Noah and his family, but also with all the living creatures. And he made a promise to them, a covenant to them. Continuing in chapter 9 in verse 8, Genesis 9, verse 8. Then God spoke to Noah and his two sons, saying, as for me, behold, I will establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living thing, creature that was with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth, and you, and all that goes into the ark, or out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I will establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off from the waters, the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. We're all aware of this covenant of God. It's what God does when he wants to establish a direction between him and between us. And it's continuing in verse 12. This shall be a sign, a covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the clouds, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth, and the rainbow shall be seen in the clouds. I will remember my covenant, which is between me and every living creature of all flesh. The water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Now, in this covenant that God made, he didn't put requirements on mankind at this time, even though he knew mankind would sin, even though mankind would become a problem once again. But he's never going to flood it again. He made a commitment, and he made that himself to all of mankind. But mankind didn't have any stipulations in this to adhere to, other than be aware of it. Also, the rainbow and the cloud, I will look to it, remember everlasting covenant in verse 16, and every living creature on flesh on this earth. And God said to Noah, the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh, that is on the earth. Also, we find that in Ezekiel, the importance of the rainbow, that I was kind of, when I studied this, I picked this and it's like, wow, I never thought of it about this way. But God has a very special place for the rainbow. Other than what he told us and what we see in the sky, Ezekiel in chapter 1 and look down to verse 28. Like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day, so is the appearance of brightness all around. This is the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the eternal. See, the world can see this promise. They may not know of it. They may not understand why that rainbow is in the sky, but the world can see it. They can see this promise, this covenant that God made with all mankind and all living things. But do they really know and understand it? I would say no, that they don't, because they use it for false indications. The rainbow with the pot of gold, the gay lesbian community using it for their insignia. No, this is God's insignia. This is what he has, the appearance of likeness of the glory of the eternal. The world sees promises, covenants, vaguely. The rainbow is why there's what means that God has stated to Noah and revealed in Ezekiel, this rainbow is special to God. But hundreds or perhaps thousands of promises that God records in our Bible go unnoticed by most of the world. Let's review a key promise or covenant that we have come to know and understand because God has revealed it to us through his Holy Spirit. There's a key covenant that was made with King David that drew me to the hills of Ireland, specifically Carintee. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen Ireland or the history of what they call the Cairn. The Cairn is basically a mound of rocks. It's a huge mound of rocks, 60, 70, 100 foot wide, and they end up being tombs or burial places for the hierarchy, the kings, the queens, or the upper level establishment in Ireland. Now, some of these cairns, these burial mounds, are older than the pyramids. So they've been around for thousands of years. And they intrigued me because just before the feast, I saw a documentary on the Discovery Channel that showed about a particular cairn called Carintee in Ireland. And it intrigued me because they said this was the tomb of Jeremiah. Now, we all know Jeremiah the prophet from our Bibles, and I listened to it, and I was surprised they had another name for him. And we'll get to that in a second. But there's so much history in Ireland, and I was just kind of shocked to find out that some of this history actually pertains to us in what God has established. The hills are beautiful. The animals, the creatures, just gorgeous around in Ireland. And the people are very, very nice and enjoyable. As we journeyed around Ireland, seeing these beautiful sights, the cliffs of Moher, the rolling green pastures, castles, and abundant life across the land, we visited the burial grounds of kings, queens, and other ranking servants, Nath, Doth, Newgrange, Loughcrew, Cairns Neolithic site, which is older than the pyramids. The word Cairns means rocks. And when you go to visit these sites or see these sites, it's very obvious. That's exactly what they look like to you. But there's a way into most of these. And some of them you can go into, and some of them you're not permitted to go into. Carintee, you're not permitted to go into. The Newgrange, we are able to go into and see. But it's just interesting because there's hieroglyphics on the rocks, on the outside and on the inside, and they identify who was once there. So it's very interesting. There's over 390 cairns in Ireland, but the one that I found, like I said, once again, most interesting is Carintee because of the connection to Olam Fodla. Have you ever heard that name before? Olam Fodla? I haven't either. I believe it's part of an Irish dialect, but it's spelled Ollamh, capital Fodhla. And we know that name by the prophet Jeremiah. That is the name that the Irish gave to him because it's exalting him, it's honoring him, it's glorifying him as a human. And he is said to be buried in Carintee. And you ask, why is this so exciting, so alluring to me? Because it holds the key to the promises that we find in the Bible about a covenant that was made with King David. So this connection between King David, the kings and queens of the lineage of King David, going up to Ireland to now the very king of England, King Charles III. So where is the throne of King David? Because in the promises that in 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 to 16, and I'm only going to read verse 16, state this. 2 Samuel 7 in verse 16, and your house and your kingdom will be established forever before you. Your throne will be established forever. And we know that when Christ returns, he is going to come as part of that King of Kings and Lord of Lords and establish his kingdom based on King David's lineage. So where is the throne of King David now? So we know that Christ will return and sit on that throne as King of Kings. But where is that on earth now? How can we trace that? Where can we see that? Now, I did a lot of research and found many articles on it. And some of the articles are a little vague and definitely telling us where they found this information or how they found this information and how it's done. But we have some information about Jeremiah and his journey away from Judah to Egypt. And then we kind of lose him in the Bible going to Ireland. But there is a lot of documentation and there's a lot of proof in this Karen T. The inscriptions and hieroglyphics on the walls on the inside show him coming in a boat and with a very important person, the daughter of King Zedekiah. Because if you recall, King Zedekiah was taken over, Judah was taken over, Jerusalem was taken over, and what happened is he was taken over by the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar, and the king was forced to watch his boys, his princes, killed in front of him. And then the last thing he saw was that, and then they took his eyes out. So the king's last visual memory was to see his boys being killed. And he was the last king of Judah. So what happened to the lineage? Well, Jeremiah took the king's daughters, and they escaped with treasures out of the temple. The Bible doesn't declare it, but in writings, they declare that Jeremiah took the Ark of the Covenant, he took a stone, and we'll get to that in a little bit, and the ladies, the princesses, went to went to Egypt, and then after a few years, when Egypt was under siege, they then left and went to Ireland. And there's, like I said, some vague documentation on that from various historians, and so we know and understand what's in the Bible, and we have to, I guess, take with a grain of salt, maybe compare notes from other historians and see what happened to Jeremiah. We need to go back into history in our Bibles and look at exactly what happened and what we're talking about this stone, because it plays a great importance. So we need to go back and turn to Genesis 28, if you would, please. Genesis 28. Genesis 28. And these verses we're about to read are referred to by scholars as Jacob's pillow or pillar. Genesis 28 in verse 10. Now Jacob went from Beersheba and went towards Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there all night because the sun had set. And then he took one of the stones in that place and put his head on it. So he rested his head up against it at night. Just, it's probably not like one of those miracle pillows, but it was somewhere to take a nap, somewhere to sleep for the night. He dreamed, and behold, the ladder came down from heaven and reached up to heaven, and there was the angels that God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac, the land which you lie. I will give it to you and your descendants. Also, your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth, You shall spread abroad east, west, and north and south. And it shall be in your seed, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I'll keep it, and you keep wherever you go, and bring it back to you for this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. So you see, Jacob had this dream about the population of this earth, north, east, south, and west. That's all the way around both directions. And that more numerous than the dust of the earth, I mean, that's just phenomenal. So we see that God had made promises. Jacob awoke and he said, surely this is the Lord's place. And I didn't know it. He said, I was afraid and said, awesome is this place. And none of the other house of God, but this gate of heaven. So Jacob rose up this early in the morning and took the stone that he had put out on his head and set it up on the pillar and poured oil on it, because he had called the name of that place Bethel. Dropping down to verse 22, and the stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house, and all of that you should give me with a surely tenth to you. So the stone has made its way from where Jacob rested on it, and it came to Judah. Now there's some history back in there. Once again, it's archives. It's out of historic, writings. And this stone was in the temple of God. Very important, as along with the Ark of Covenant. So there was many things that were in the temple, and Jeremiah took those because he knew what was going to happen. He was in touch with the king's men, with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar wanted him out of there because the fact of he realized that Jeremiah was with God and that he could be cursed if he didn't play nice with Jeremiah, basically. So it's kind of interesting, but this stone has made its way to the British Isles. And recently, it has appeared in an inauguration of King Charles. This is what they call the coronation chair. Now, you may not have seen it if you watched the coronation, because by the time they have their gowns and their accoutrements and their coverings and everything else, you probably don't see much of this coronation chair. But it's there. You can go look at it now. But what's most important is on the bottom of it, there's a stone. That stone is referred to in the Bible as the stone that Jacob's pillow, that Jacob rested on. This stone is where historically you can trace the lineage of the kings that sat on this for coronation. And I have the entire list from the time of David up until King Charles that list who sat on this throne to be coronated, to be brought into the kingship. So it's very interesting. There were some articles that were just outstanding. Once again, they're not the biblical part, but history at times provides us with a lot of great information. And we have to weigh it against what the Bible says. There was an article entitled Jeremiah in Ireland, Proof from the Bible that the Irish annals are accurate. And so what they did is he compared the facts in the Bible, the statements in the Bible, compared them to the Irish annals, the history books basically of Ireland, and also looking at Carantee and seeing the hieroglyphics. Now, years ago, the hieroglyphics could not be evaluated. Mankind couldn't really figure it out. But recently, because of the state of technology, they're able to evaluate the hieroglyphics, and they could prove the date that Jeremiah arrived there, and they could prove that Jeremiah came because of the depiction of a ship with passengers and the gender showing on these hieroglyphics. And also, in addition to the princesses, Jeremiah brought his scriptor, his writer, Baruch. And so they can see this through hieroglyphics, which they couldn't do for thousands of years. But now, because of technology, they could evaluate all the different symbols and everything else, and they came up with an understanding of the hieroglyphics. So it's quite amazing. He states in here, one of the most beloved stories of the traditional literature written by those who support the modern identity of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, which we certainly understand, the story of coming of the prophet of Jeremiah to Ireland. According to the story, he came there shortly after 586 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, conquered Jerusalem. Jeremiah the prophet accompanied his scribe Baruch and the daughters of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, that fled the country for a short time into Egypt, where they took a ship to Ireland, and one of the daughters married Ecola, the king of Ireland. So we see where the transfer from the last king of Judah now went to his daughter, who married the king of Ireland, and then kept the throne of David perpetuated. Because that's what's important, because a covenant was made with King David. And if the last king would have died with no successor because his sons were killed, what would have happened to the covenant? Well, God keeps his covenant. God keeps his promises 100% to whoever he makes them to. So you see that Jeremiah took these individuals and this stone and brought it to Ireland. And the succession of the throne of David maintained. And it maintained all the way to Charles III now, the current king of England. The stone has been moved from Ireland to Scotland and back to England because it got absconded, as the words that they used, and then it went back to Scotland. And it's kind of now in territory where they share it and they use it because Scottish leaders were brought up on it and inaugurated, and also Irish leaders were, and now the King of England. From the Bible, we can prove that Jeremiah was taken to Egypt. If you look in Jeremiah 43 verses 5 through 7, it talks about, like in verse 6, men, women, and children, the kings and daughters, and every person with Nebuchadnezzar, the captain of the guard, who had left Gedaliah, the son of Achim, and the son of Shaphan, Jeremiah the prophet, Baruch, the son of Neri, and also went to the land of Egypt. And they did not obey the voice of the Lord as they far went to Taphanes. So you see, the Bible tells us that they went to Egypt, but the Bible doesn't tell us that they went to Ireland. Once again, we look to the annals of Irish history, and we can see, based on hieroglyphics now that we understand, they arrived there in approximately 583 BC. So after Jeremiah put about a 4-year stint in Egypt, he went to Ireland. Now, I have study papers that I can share with you, the Queen's royal descent from King David to the psalmist. So the Queen back in 1953, she announced that she was part of King David's lineage because she knew the lineage from going through all the kings, whether they be in Ireland or Scotland, whether they be in England. And she announces that she's part of that. And so her son, who just took the throne, also announces that he is a part of that lineage. So King David's lineage is still here. King David's lineage is still in the process, waiting for Christ to return to take it over. So the covenant has never been broken. We may have lost some historical events, but if you look to the details, you'll see that King David, his covenant with God, is still honored by God. There's also another article, Welcome to the Tomb of Jeremiah, the Bible Prophet, which goes into great detail. Once again, there is proof that God has kept his the covenant with God. And we see that it's quite amazing how God no matter who it is to. He kept the promise to Noah and to all living men and all animals. He keeps his promise to everyone. He keeps his promise to you and I. In the beginning of Mr. Peterson, he talked about the opportunity that we all have to know God and to serve God. And we need to always keep that in the back of our minds, that God is going to be with us to the very end. He's going to be with us in everything we think, do, and say. We ask him, and he will provide. You can make a covenant with God. You can make a promise with God, but be aware that you need to keep it, because God keeps all of his promise. And if he joins into a covenant, then you will join in it. And his covenant to you and I is now the New Testament. The New Testament is the covenant that he made with all of mankind. For us initially, because he has inspired us, he has taken us through the veil of the Holy of Holies. Because of his bloodshed, we now are allowed to go to the Father. We know the Father now, where the world didn't know the Father, hasn't known the Father, and the world right now doesn't know the Father. But we have been called. We have been called into the covenant, a very sacred covenant, a very important covenant that will encounter all of mankind. But right now, you and I are part of it. Christ shed blood for the remission of our sins has tore the veil between the Father and mankind, for us right now and for all mankind eventually. It's very important that we honor the covenant that we took part of when we were baptized. That baptism, we committed to God. We committed to the Father, and we said that we will obey and follow. We will keep his commandments, the testimony that Jesus Christ has taught us. Yes, we are part of the new covenant, and we know, based on all the biblical examples, God's promises, God's covenants will never be voided, because God will never lie. He will never deceive us. He will never ignore us. He is with us till he returns.